So my goal this morning is to complicate your relationship with the state and state authority by digging into a typically unexamined assumption, which is that we have a duty, a moral obligation to obey the government. That when the government, a government official, a legislator, a leader, the law as codified tells you to do something or tells you not to do something, if you violate that, if you don't follow that command, you have done something morally blameworthy, something morally wrong, just by nature of having disobeyed the command. And most political thinking just assumes that. So when we talk about what government should do, how it should be structured, what laws it should pass, and so on, we assume that anything it does say, all of us need to go along with. So it's state power is legitimate and justified. And I want to dig into that because there's something weird about the claim of state legitimacy and power, and something that is different from the way that we think about obligations in the rest of our lives. So the simple claim I'll start with, that'll build this off of, is we need reasons to obey commands. So if I just come up to one of you and command you to mow my lawn or drive me somewhere, it's perfectly reasonable for you to say no, right? Like there's nothing in the nature of our relationship that allows me to make those kinds of commands of you or creates a reasonable expectation that you will follow them. And this kind of thinking applies even when it's the state. We need to justify why the state commands are somehow different. And so what we're going to do today is we're going to walk through some of the arguments, the most typical arguments for why we might have a moral obligation to obey the state, and ask if they hold up to scrutiny, if they're any good. First, though, let's zero in on what exactly it is that the state demands of us, that it expects us to obey, because it's unique. It's different from the other kinds of commands or obedience we might have to others. So the first is broadly obedience. The state expects that when it issues a command, you will follow it, and if you don't follow it, the state is morally justified in punishing you, fining you, locking you up, compelling you to follow, and so on. The second is non-competition. So the state says, you owe me obedience, and you don't owe anyone else obedience. And you can't come into this area where the borders that I have set out and set up a competing kind of obedience. You can't start your own state. So you cannot compete with me. And the third thing that the state demands of us is resources. So it says, I'm going to do a bunch of things, and I need resources in order to accomplish those things, and so you have to give them to me. So this could be taxes, but it could also be labor, but some way where you are providing directly to enable the government to carry out its various functions. So as we go through these arguments, it's important to think about not just do the arguments get us to some level of obedience, but do they get to all three of these? Because notice that if any one of these three is not justified, then governments as we think of them are in trouble on the grounds of political legitimacy. So we need all three. And the other part to keep in the back of your mind as we go through these is how if the argument gets you to obedience and non-competition and resources, but for everyone, Like if the argument says you owe obedience to every person you encounter, whether they're in the government or not, you owe non-competition to every person, you owe resources to every person, then that also is going to be a problem. So we need to find all three, and we need to find all three in a way that is unique to governments. Broadly speaking, theories of state legitimacy, which is what we're talking about here, fall into one of four categories, four kinds of arguments. So there's consent-based arguments, there's gratitude arguments, there's fair play, and there's association arguments. And we're going to go through each of the four and see if they get us to these requirements. But I'm going to start with a fifth one, which we'll call natural duty. And I'm going to start there because natural duty looks like a theory of obligation, but it's not quite what I have in mind. So we're going to tackle it in order to set it aside as not what we're actually talking about. So what a natural duty account says is we have a duty to do what the state tells us to because of some other moral requirement. So one way to think about this is that the command, the agent of the government comes up and tells you to do something, aligns with a pre-existing moral condition. So if the government tells you, has a law against murder, you should follow that law against murder. But you're not following it because there's a law against murder. You're following it because murder is wrong. So even if there weren't a law against murder, or if the government passed a law saying you should engage in murder, you still should not murder people because it is wrong. The same for theft and fraud and all of these other like immoral acts that you might undertake. They're wrong not because the government said they're wrong, but rather the government is saying they're wrong. Hopefully it's saying they're wrong because it's recognized the underlying morality. Another one is consequentialist accounts. So what a consequentialist account says is, look, the world is better if we all obey the government. We'll be wealthier, we'll solve coordination problems. Thank you very much. Just the consequences of following the law are better than the consequences of not following the law, either individually or just more broadly. And then a third way to think about this is we have a duty to obey just institutions. So if an institution is just, then you should comply with it. So we talked a bit about the problem of the command aligns with another moral obligation. And the problem there is that that's not really political obligation because your obligation is not to the government to follow that law. It is to the underlying moral rule. Consequentialism, if it says we should do what produces the best results, and obedience results in a better world than disobedience, the problem here is that what that means is if our moral commitment is to consequences, right? It's not to obedience, it's to consequences. And obedience are a way to get to better consequences. Then we should only, morally, we should only obey when it produces good consequences, right? And so what it says is, if every time the government gives you a command, you should evaluate what the consequences of following that's going to be, and if they're good, comply. If they're bad, and lots of laws have bad consequences, you're actually obligated to disobey. And that calls into question this blanket assumption of obedience that states have. And so it's not really obligation, it's more just a theory of prudence. Just institutions, so this is the theory that the philosopher John Rawls advanced. So he said, we have a moral duty of justice, and that this moral duty of justice, quote, requires us to support and to comply with just institutions that exist and apply to us. So if there's a just institution that applies to you, it's in existence, you should support it, you should comply with it, and at the very least, you shouldn't interfere with what it does. One obvious objection to this is that no government, even the best of them, if we look around the world, even the best of them, is 100% just. Every government does things that are unjust and sometimes monstrously unjust. And so if we have this moral duty of justice, then does that mean that that duty only extends to the just parts of government? And so government is not like a single thing. It's a whole bunch of institutions, right? And so it might be you have to obey this part of government, but justice requires disobeying this part of government, or splitting commands. It becomes very complicated and runs into problems with blanket obedience and authority. It also doesn't really solve the non-competition problem. Because even if we grant that there are states that have different levels of justice and that parts of them are just, we have to solve this applies problem. So what it means for a government to apply to you is that you live within, say, the territory that that government has laid claim to, or you're a citizen of that particular government. But that itself, the fact that the government has claimed this part of this territory, or says this is how citizenship works, is grounded in its legitimacy, right? Like if it's an illegitimate state, so if it's just some random guy says, I am now a government and half of you here are citizens, obey me, we don't think that that's actually a government that applies to us because its legitimacy has not been established. Or if someone says, I am claiming this building as my personal sovereignty, this territory, this geographical spot is now mine, these walls constitute its borders, the law that I say now applies to you, we say you haven't established legitimacy yet. But if we ditch that, if we try to disentangle these things, then we end up in this very weird situation where we could have a moral duty to obey more than one government. So you might say, this part of the Indian government is just, and so I'm going to obey it. But this part of the Belgian government is more just in this aspect, and so now I also have a duty to obey that part of the Belgian government and that other part of the Canadian government. And that becomes, that sounds exhausting for one, but that non-competition and blanket obedience becomes really problematic. The third issue with this is that governments also prevent us, non-competition, they prevent us from creating new governments, right? Like, so you can participate in democracy and change it that way, but you can't overthrow, they will get mad at you if you try to overthrow the existing regime and replace it with something else, even if what you're replacing it with is more just than what. And so if we take seriously the moral duty of justice, that our job is to support just institutions, then it would seem we have a moral duty in many cases to rebel against a given government. And we can think of lots of historical examples where we think rebellions were morally justified. But if that's the case, then the obedience and non-competition prongs of our three-part requirement drop away. So natural duty doesn't seem to work, but we have 4 more. So we'll see how well those work. The next is consent. So this is social contract theory. This is Locke and Hobbes, but you can find versions of this argument in many philosophical traditions. And this says you have somehow agreed. You have consented to be governed. And so you have consented to obedience on competition and resources or taxation. And so because you agreed to this, you're now obligated to follow through on that agreement. You're doing something wrong if you renege on it. And this can be either explicit or implicit. So an explicit version of consent would be, say, you become a citizen of a new country. So you take a citizenship oath, and that oath says, I agree to obey these laws. But most of us most of us are citizens of the country we were born into. We never took a citizenship oath. But there's other ways you might think about explicit. So voting might be a form of explicit consent. You know, you say, I'm going to participate in this process and by this decision-making process, and by participating, you are agreeing to abide by the outcome. Even if it's not the outcome you preferred, that you voted for. You know, so this might be and we can see how this works in ordinary life, right? Like if you're with a group of friends and you're gonna go to a restaurant and you're figuring out which restaurant, there's two restaurants that you're trying to decide between, and your friends and you all agree, like, let's put it to a vote. And you vote for restaurant A, but the majority picks restaurant B. If you then throw a fit and storm out and, you know, you look like a jerk, right? Like by agreeing to, like, this is a good way to decide, you should go along with it and go to the restaurant even if it's not your preference, right? Like that makes sense. But there's some problems with explicit consent. So first, let's say, so we already talked about how most of us are just born into the country we're citizens of. We didn't take that act. Voting, though, so a lot of people can't vote, right? Like there might be age limitations, and you're still, even if you're too young to vote, you're still expected to obey. Or in the US, a lot of states don't allow people with felony convictions to vote. You're stripped of your right to vote if you have a felony conviction. But you're still expected to obey the laws. Or if you're a non-citizen living within the borders, you're still expected to obey the laws, but you're not allowed to vote. Next, a lot of us vote, but defensively. So it isn't like picking the restaurant. It's more like you get mugged on the street and the person's holding a gun to your head and they say, give me your wallet or I'll take your life. And so you hand them the wallet. We don't say you've consented to turn over your wallet, right? We say, like, you had two bad decisions. Your absolute preference would have been neither of these things, but you picked the one that was the least bad. But that doesn't look like consent. And then the third real problem with consent is, even set aside all of those. Like, let's say you take a citizenship oath and you agree. You say, here's that I'm agreeing to, the Constitution sets out these rules and the statute set out these rules, and I'm agreeing to abide by it, and I solemnly swear to do so. So as explicit consent as you can possibly get. There's this open question of how long does that last? You know, contracts have time limits on them. And what have you agreed to? Because one thing about governments is they change the rules all the time. And they might change the rules in directions that you would not have consented to. And sometimes they change the rules through democratic processes, but then maybe we get into this defensive voting problem with that. Sometimes they change the rules just unilaterally. And again, thinking about contracts, if you sign a contract, say you're renting a place to live, and the contract says you'll pay this amount every month and your landlord will provide you with the following stuff, and that's the terms of the contract, and you've signed it, and then sometime later your landlord just says, oh, I'm raising the rent by 50%, or oh, I'm going to stop providing, I said I would repair your appliances, but I'm not going to do that. I'm changing the terms of the contract. The contract, you don't have to abide by that. The contract is now void. They violated it, right? So that would seem to apply to even the most explicit forms of consent to obedience, non-competition, and taxation or resources. But then there's implicit consent. So implicit consent is you haven't actually like said something explicitly, but your behaviors have indicated that you consent. So you continue to live within the, you could leave if you don't like it. So just by your continued presence, it indicates that you're consenting. Or using services. The government provides services, you use them. By using them, so we'll go back to a restaurant, if you pay the bill at the end of your meal, right? But by walking into the restaurant, sitting down, ordering food, eating it, like using the services the restaurant provides, you have consented to pay the bill at the end, even though you didn't sign a contract when you sat down saying that. And you would do something wrong if you got up and left. So maybe that. Problems with implicit consent, though, are first, it must be a genuine choice. You can't consent if it wasn't a choice. And so the living within the borders, say, or the using the services, the philosopher David Hume criticized the social contract, and he put it this way. He said, can we seriously say that a poor peasant or artisan has a free choice to leave his country when he knows no foreign language or manners and lives from day to day by the small wages which he acquires? It's one thing to move to a different country if you're wealthy and speak the language and have a network you can draw on and so on, but a lot of people it's just not an option to go somewhere else. And so their continued presence within the country doesn't necessarily indicate consent. Or they can't afford to opt out of the services that the government provides, and so their use of those services doesn't necessarily indicate consent. And even implicit consent runs into that same problem of how long does it last, and how broad is the consent, and what if it changes? And then there are just times when, finally, on consent, the government explicitly repudiates the social contract. So I'll give a really, I think, horrific example from the US. I lived for about 8 months in a town in Colorado called Castle Rock. And a few decades ago, I think it was in maybe the 1990s, there was an instance where a woman who lived in Castle Rock had an abusive husband. And so she filed for a restraining order saying he's not allowed to come near her or her kids. And the government granted this restraining order. So he's legally supposed to stay a distance away from her and her children. Sometime later, she saw him around, and she called the Castle Rock Police Department and said, hey, I'm worried. I've seen him, he's coming around. I have a restraining order, can you enforce the restraining order? And the cops didn't. And he kidnapped the children and murdered them. And she sued. She sued the government of Castle Rock. But she said, look, I have an agreement with you that you are going, the government has agreed to provide me certain services. Among them is enforcement of this restraining order, and you failed, right? And this case went all the way up to the US Supreme Court, and the US Supreme Court said no. It said, you have no legal recourse if the government fails to fulfill its promises to you. There's nothing you can do about it. But notice, it didn't then say, because we haven't held up our side of the social contract, you no longer need to pay your taxes or obey the laws, right? It said you still have to uphold your side of the contract, but we're going to ignore ours. And this was a very explicit repudiation, right? And we can find examples like this over and over and over again. The government does not act as an equal partner in these contracts. So consent seems like it runs into problems. But we have three more. Fair play. Fair play says if we benefit from some sort of cooperative scheme, we need to abide by the rules of that scheme, or else we're free riding on those benefits, on others who have done so. So the philosopher H.L.A. Hart set out this argument in 1955, and he said, when a number of persons conduct any joint enterprise according to rules and thus restrict their liberty, because following rules is a restriction on your liberty to do otherwise, those who have submitted to those restrictions when required have a right to a similar submission from those who have benefited from their submission. So what does this mean? If a bunch of people have sacrificed in some way, followed rules, paid for something, and you benefit from it and continue to benefit from it, you should equally contribute in that same way. Or you're free riding off of their work and you've done something wrong, morally wrong. Robert Nozick, who I mentioned in passing yesterday, had an objection to this on this idea of community radio argument. So the argument goes something like this. There's a town with 365 houses in it, and at the center of town is a tall tower with speakers on top. And you move into this town and you discover that every day someone else goes up into that tower and they play music, they read the news, they put on a little community radio station, right? And months in, someone comes up to you and says, okay, it's your turn to do this. And you say, look, I'm really busy. I have to take care of a sick family member. I have to be out of town then. Whatever it is, like you can't do it. You don't want to do it. Now, you've received benefits from this, from the prior people who restricted their liberty by setting aside their day to do this, because, you know, the music was fine. You enjoyed it at times. It was helpful to hear the news. You know, these weren't extraordinary benefits that you achieved, but they were, you know, on the whole, you came out ahead hearing this. And it was blasted through town, so you didn't really have an option to, if you were out and about, you were hearing it. You know? So it wasn't something where you could have said at the beginning, I don't want this. And Nozick said that really matters as to whether you're doing something wrong if you don't go up and run the radio station for a day. Because he said in order for obligation to happen, in order for there to be obligation, it's not just enough that there are benefits, but that those benefits were accepted by you as opposed to merely received by you. So you had to have an option to turn down the benefits. Because if you don't, then merely enjoying them doesn't indicate that you consented to, that it creates an obligation to pay back the other people who similarly sacrificed. Because there are lots of people out there doing lots of things cooperatively that are costly to them that all of us would, you know, say, that's great, I'm glad you're doing that, but I'm not interested in like taking advantage of it or benefiting from it. Or, you know, the community builds a playground, but you don't have kids, you're not going to use it. You know, so accepting the benefits is important. So that raises then some questions as an account of political obligation and legitimacy. First is which kind are most state benefits? Are they benefits that you can accept and therefore reject, or are they benefits that you receive? And in a lot of cases, they're ones that you receive. It would be awfully, the state pays to build roads, and libertarians have this long history of hating roads, hating state roads, right? But it would be awfully hard to not use, to say, I'm going to opt out of roads and sidewalks in my life, would be a challenging thing to do. Likewise with police protection, military protection, all these other things, you don't really, you receive them, but it's hard to say, it's hard to opt out. Next, one thing that states do, and this is part of the non-competition, is it may be that you benefit from, say, the public schools that are available to you, or the police protection. You benefit in some way, but we could imagine how those services could be a lot better. We could imagine how, like, in some of the services, if they were privatized and we had competition among providers for them, the quality would be much higher, the cost would be much lower, and so the benefits to us would be greater, such that, like, if we could choose between them, we would accept the benefits of, like, the privatized versus the public. But the state often cuts off those alternatives. It doesn't allow for others to provide them. And so that makes it even more challenging from this accepting criteria, because we could say, yes, I could opt out of using these schools, but what would be even better is if I could opt into accepting the benefits from other providers, but you're not allowing me to do that. And that seems to be a problem for creating obligations in this fair play account. Another problem is just, is the state a cooperative scheme? So we can tell a story that the state is all of us acting together. It's just what we do when that's what the state is a group of people. But that's not really how most states work. States have members of the state who have their own interests, and we pay them, and then they provide us services. And so it looks more like a company that you engage with, right? So like your internet service provider, you benefit from that. You opted into those benefits because you could choose not to have internet service. They might have a monopoly. Where I used to live outside of Washington, D.C., my community had signed an agreement with one internet service provider. And so if I wanted internet, they were the only people I could use, right? But the service wasn't great, but I still benefited from it over not having service. But it would be weird to think of that service provider as a cooperative scheme, right? Like, it wasn't my community coming together to give ourselves internet service. It was all of us paying Comcast Communications some number of dollars every month and getting a service. And the government looks often more like that than a community having like a potluck dinner where everyone brings a meal and shares it. Next, though, if the state is a cooperative scheme, because there are elements of it that look more like that, does it create specifically political obligations, right? So notice who the obligations are to in these. If we set up this potluck dinner and share the food, if you come and eat food there, so you are obligated to bring food to share, right? Like, you'd be doing something wrong if you showed up without bringing something. But who is that obligation to bring something? Who holds that obligation? It's the other people in the cooperative scheme, right? And so if the state is a cooperative scheme, then what this means is that our obligation is not to the people at the top, but it would be to all of our fellow citizens. I'm obligated to similarly sacrifice or to provide benefits or to pay back, right? And so, like, if all of you pitched in to, you pitch in taxes, say, to pay for a school, it might be my obligation, I have an obligation, but it's to give all of you money as opposed to giving the government money, right? Or it's to do something for you as opposed to for the government. And so that, like, specificity, that problem of why does this create obligations specifically for governments and not for everyone else becomes a problem. And finally, why, if it's fair play, why is repaying that sacrifice, why does it come in the form of obedience and taxes versus anything else that we might do for people? Gratitude. So gratitude tries to get around some of these problems with fair play. And the way that it does it is it says, look, we have all gained in some way from the state. Security, received goods, received services. And so just the accumulation of those over our lives means that we should feel like we are in the state's debt somehow. And then we have to repay that debt. And the way you repay that debt is obedience, non-competition, and taxes. So unlike consent, it's not about something that we individually choose, but how we ought to feel by kind of the circumstances we find ourselves in. We ought to feel a debt of gratitude. And unlike fair play, it's not dependent on accepting versus receiving. Just the mere fact that we benefited, even potentially against our will, we still owe a debt for those benefits. We should still feel gratitude for those benefits. So this, again, we can see how this plays out in our ordinary lives. You know, we have teachers, mentors, our parents, and so on who've done things for us. We've benefited from them. We should feel gratitude towards them. And it can even happen if it's against your will or against, so someone, you are heavily addicted to a harmful drug and someone really wants to help you. You don't want, like in that time when you don't want the help. You're angry at them. You're refusing the help. Like you have not in any way consented. If you had an option to opt out of them putting you into rehab or otherwise helping you, you would reject it in the moment. You're angry at them and so on. But then they get you, they override those concerns of yours. They get you into rehab. They get you off of the drugs. And sometime later, you feel gratitude for them, right? That seems perfectly reasonable. And then we can say you're in their debt, and so you should look for ways to repay them. That sounds reasonable. But the problems here, first, a rather obvious one is, why do we repay by obedience? We don't do that with other debts, right? Like if that person helped you out, got you into rehab, got you clean, there are lots of ways you can repay them, but if they then demand that you become their servant, we'd say, no, they've done something wrong. That's not the kind of demand that they can make. Or they demand that you just start paying 30% of your income to them and then lock you in their basement if you refuse. That seems to, not only have they done something wrong, but you're like, okay, I don't feel gratitude to you anymore. So why repay with obedience? And of course, we're in debt to lots of people. All of us have benefited tremendously from an extraordinary number of people in our lives. So why only the state is the one that we owe obedience, non-competition, and taxation to? Another one is, we'll tell a story to introduce this one. So you are in a car accident, okay? And the car's flipped over, you're trapped inside, and two police officers come along and they pull you out of the car, but unfortunately, because of the nature of the accident, both legs are broken in the process of getting you out. They get you to the hospital. Your life is saved, okay? Now, it would make sense to feel a debt of gratitude to these police officers who saved your life. And maybe even saved your life unwillingly, in the sense that maybe you were unconscious at the time. So they didn't say, hey, do you want me to get you out of the car? And you said yes, right? Like they did this without your explicit consent. But you feel these guys saved your life, right? And so maybe, like, at the very least, feeling a sense of gratitude towards them is warranted. However, now imagine you're in the hospital bed, convalescing, both legs in casts, and a stranger comes in and says, hey, I know that those cops got you out, but actually, you should know what really happened. The car flipped over while you were unconscious. I came up, and I have a lot of experience with whatever, he's a structural engineer or something. I don't know what kind of person would have experience getting someone out of a, but imagine that there's such a person. And I could have gotten you out without your legs getting broken, right? But as I was about to do it, these two police officers showed up, told me this was the job of the police, shoved me aside and yanked you out of the car hastily, without any skill, and broke both your legs in the process. Now your feelings of gratitude towards them change, right? Now you don't feel gratitude towards them anymore because your legs are broken. The state does that all the time. So again, the state benefits us, but it also prevents lots of people from benefiting us in greater ways. And often the benefits that we get come with costs, terrible costs sometimes. Like, it benefits us, but at the same time it's inflicting tremendous suffering on others, or dropping bombs on innocent people, or locking people up, or abusing them, whatever it happens to be. And it might be to the extent where we say, for some people who really have boots on their necks from the state, they might have a persuasive case that, look, I benefit in some ways from the state, but in fact, on the whole, I've been hurt by it more than I have benefited. Or I've benefited, but I'd be better, would have benefited more if they had allowed a different state, a smaller state, one that was more democratic, one that had fewer regulations, whatever it happens to be. And so they look more like the cops who broke your legs because they were unskillful than the cops who just rushed in and saved your life without any complications. So the problem with gratitude is it's not clear that it creates the kinds of debts that it's not clear that obedience, non-competition, and taxation are the ways you repay a debt of gratitude. It's not clear why, even if they are, they would be owed to the government versus everyone else, exclusively to the government versus everyone else who you have benefited from. And ultimately, gratitude reduces to something like, if the state's good for me, has been overall good for me, I'll support it. If it isn't, I won't. And that's not a strong grounds for obligation, right? That's not a strong grounds for the kind of authority that states claim. But we have one more, so maybe this one will work. This is association. So here's the argument. We're all Indians. We're all Americans. That's it. That's the argument. It says, if we're all Indians, then you're part of this thing called India, right? You're a member of this association. And being a member of this, being part of this thing, means obeying the laws, non-competition, and taxation. So if fair play and gratitude are about something that we have done or something that's happened to us, consent as well, association says actually the grounding of political authority is just in who we are. By being a certain kind of person, you are obligated. Political obligations are just part of what it means to be part of, to be a member of a community. So if this works, it gets around all of the concerns that we have set out, because it essentially says, by your nature, you must obey, whether you've benefited or not, whether you consented or not, whether you're free riding or not, because you're Indian or because you're American or because you're Canadian, you're obligated to obey. And we get versions of this in our ordinary lives. So this is familial obligations work this way. You didn't choose to be a member of the family that you were born into, but you are a member of that family. And we recognize that by the very fact of being a member of that family, you have certain obligations to others within it, to your parents, to your siblings, and so on. So we can ask, though, is the state really like a family? No, right? Like, so I live in the US, I'm subject to its laws, right? I was born into the US, I was born an American. And I like a lot of people, you know, and I'm sure most of my fellow citizens are lovely people, but I don't feel the same way towards them that I feel to my wife and kids, right? And it would actually be weird if I did. And so it doesn't feel quite the same, or it doesn't feel the same as if I'm a member of a certain local community, church, say, if I'm a member of the church, you feel a different kind of connection than you do to just like everybody, and certainly than you do to the government. Another problem with this, that if it's mere just membership in the community, unchosen typically, membership in the community that is the grounding for this blanket obligations, then we're obligated no matter how bad the community is. Because it doesn't factor in where you say, like, if the community is a certain level of goodness and I'm a member then, this is just you're a member. And so with a family, we can imagine you have certain duties to your parents, but if your parents are sufficiently abusive, then those duties drop away, right? Similarly, if you are born into North Korea and you're a North Korean, the government of North Korea is not great, right? It's pretty awful to its citizens. And it feels like something has gone wrong with the argument if you say you are obligated to obey and support the government of North Korea simply because you were born into the northern part of the Korean peninsula, right? Like an argument that gets you to that, it seems like it's defeated itself. And finally, our feelings of association may be misleading. So you might actually feel like a real connection to this, like feel like you are part of this thing. And you might feel obligations because of that, but that can be misleading. Cults are an example of this, right? Like you might be a member of a cult, either you joined it or you were like brought up in it by your parents, and you feel this deep connection to its charismatic leader. But from outside, we can see like the people in that cult have been brainwashed, have been manipulated, that those feelings of connection and association are to some degree inauthentic or are abusive, that we from the outside can see these people would be better off if they could get out of those feelings. And states are not typically cults. There are some that seem, North Korea might well be a cult. Turkmenistan might be a cult. But most states don't seem to be cults in the way that we typically think about them. That said, all states engage in activities designed to make you feel like you are part of something bigger than you, right? So I used to live in Washington, D.C. In Washington, D.C., all the government buildings are constructed in this classical architectural style reminiscent of Greece and Rome. And the reason they are is because that creates a sense that this government, that these buildings, that's housed in these buildings, is part of this grand tradition stretching back to the origins of Western civilization, and so is bigger than any one of us. Or judges wear the severe black robes and sit up high so they feel like when you walk in and you see those, it's always somewhat striking to see like Supreme Court justices out of uniform and like in the normal world because they seem much smaller. And that's intentional. That like pageantry and iconography and imagery is intentional. It's meant to make you feel like this thing is bigger than you and that it's an honor and privilege to be a part of it. And we don't need to dismiss all of that. History matters, tradition matters. There are reasons to look up to certain institutions and so on, but there is an intentional effort by governments to create these feelings. And so we should be a little bit skeptical of the feeling of association. Okay, so we're out of our big arguments. And I picked these, I should note, because in the philosophical field of studying political obligation and political authority, these are the main arguments. And so you get versions of them, or you get versions where it pulls from a handful of them to try to fill in gaps, but these are the core. And these aren't new. There's wonderful dialogue by Plato called the Credo, which is where Socrates has been condemned to death by the people of Athens for impiety and corrupting the youth. And he's in prison, and some friends come and they say, hey, like, we can get you out. You can come into exile. It'll be great. No one's going to bother you. Basically, the people of Athens are expecting you to do this, right? Like, no one's going to be really mad if you run off. You walk right out of here. It's not going to be challenging. You don't have to drink the hemlock. And Socrates sets out arguments for why, no, that would be wrong for him to do that. That he was convicted by this very large jury of his Athenian peers, and he is obligated to follow through on the command of drinking the hemlock. And all of these arguments are in there. So these go back. This is how state authority wins state authority. As in the beginning, most of the time we don't talk about justifying state authority. We just assume it and then go from there. So if they don't work, or they don't get us completely there, because all of them, notice all of them do, in the abstract, they're all arguments for obligations in some way, right? Like if you agree, if you consent to something, you make a promise, I'm going to drive you to the airport tomorrow morning to catch your flight, and then I don't do it. I don't show up in the morning to pick you up. I've done something wrong, right? We can say, like, you're obligated if you agreed to take your friend to the airport. Or if you benefit from other people, you should try to repay them. Or if you feel a debt of gratitude, and you should feel debts of gratitude, that creates certain obligations. Or if you're a member of certain groups, that membership brings with it certain obligations. All of them have degrees of obligation, but none of them seem to get us to the really robust three-part obedience, non-competition, taxation, and none of them seem to get us to specifically why this applies just to this one institution calling itself the state versus lots of other people and lots of other institutions. So where does this leave us then? Yes?
On the social contract bit, so my understanding is that we give up some rights to the state
Yes.
in order for it to protect us. In the sense, it does its bare minimum function. Right? The bare minimum function of the state is to provide security and law and order.
Yeah.
So you're getting that in return of surrendering some of your rights. That's how they are able to have a check and balance. Now, I don't. That's why I don't get the part where you're saying there is a contract which is changing when the rules are changing. I understand they might not keep their end of the bargain, like
Yeah.
the case that
Yeah.
you mentioned. That I, my thinking that it's a feature of us losing tort law, perhaps, because tort law is through which we could actually sue the state, even for these kind of unwritten obligations. I think at least in India we don't enforce tort law anymore. I'm not sure what's the scene in the US. Like just
Yeah, so we can sue the state, but sometimes the state says, when you sue the state, the person who decides whether your lawsuit is successful is the state. But no, the rules do change pretty frequently, and often in ways that you didn't participate in. So we, in the US, not terribly long ago, like let's say that you were a social conservative who didn't think that gay marriage was acceptable. And so the agreement, and gay marriage was illegal in a lot of places in the US, and so the agreement that was part of your agreement. Like you become a citizen, and that's part of your agreement is I'm gonna live in a society that enforces a prohibition on gay marriage, right? And then some years back, the United States Supreme Court said actually the Constitution gives gay people a right to get married. That wasn't a democratic decision, right? You didn't participate in that. That was 9 unelected people who just made this decision, and now the rules have changed. And you might be really mad about that and say, okay, that's not what I agreed to. Or you're more progressive and having reproductive freedom and access to abortion is important to you. And a few years back, the Supreme Court made a decision that allowed states to start banning access to these services without your agreement. And that feels like a very fundamental rule that has changed without your consent. Some other versions of this. And so that's what I'm getting at is there's no government that is this kind of like minimal, all we're going to do is protect you from brigands, from robbers, from like, that's not it. They do all of these things, and all of those things are changing all of the time. And so the question is like, when you agree, so I agree, like you're gonna give up some of your rights, you're gonna give up some of your resources in exchange for, like that exchange for what is it that you're agreeing to? What rights are you agreeing to give up? What resources? Taxes go up all the time. And when does that change become sufficient that you're saying that's no longer what I agreed to? So, where does this leave us? Well, I think at best, if we give all of these arguments all the benefits of the doubt that we can, they get us to they justify a very minimal state. So one that looks more like we're just going to protect you from violence and theft and take a small number of resources. Those seem easier, those kinds of agreements seem easier to justify on the grounds of all of this. Another issue, if we take these seriously, and we take these seriously as creating obligations to others, because these are all just like, none of these are specifically about the state. That was one of the problems with them, is they're all theories of obligation that apply much more broadly than just questions of the state, is in some cases it would seem if we take these seriously, they create obligations to disobey. the state. So if I have benefited from you and I owe you a debt of gratitude, and then I see the government dramatically harming you, it might be that like this debt of gratitude that I have to you, or this debt of fair play because you've sacrificed for me and now I'm going to sacrifice for you, might say I actually have to like interfere with the state in order to help you. Or if I'm part of this association, I have obligations to my family members and I see the government hurting them. That associational duty might say I have an obligation, it's not that I don't have an obligation to obey, but I might have a positive obligation to disobey. What if they don't work at all, though? Well, I think there's two ways that we can respond to that. So the first is what gets called philosophical anarchism. So this is different than political anarchism says, okay, smash the state, tear it down. If it's not legitimate, it's, like there should not be in the world. Philosophical anarchism is a softer version of that. And so it is just the acknowledgement that ultimately this moral authority of the state is ungrounded. And so we might have other reasons, you go back to some of the natural duty accounts that we talked about, consequentialism and so on, to act as if, but we should kind of keep in the back of our mind that authority is more complicated than we're typically told. So there are lots of philosophical anarchists who are not political anarchists because they think, okay, yeah, maybe the authority is not justified, but actual anarchism, abolishing governments, would be bad, would lead to widespread suffering because violence would go unchecked, property rights would not be enforced, people would suffer on a scale, and so the cost of basically accepting, even if the arguments aren't great, authority that is a cost, but it's a lower one than there are other considerations, other things that should factor into our moral thinking than just whether this command is legitimate.
So on this note of philosophical anarchism, can't we say that even Hobbesian understanding is based on that? Because Hobbes did talk about, okay, that there is a state of nature where no one is safe and you actually have no rights because anyone can come in and do anything to
Yeah.
you. And because of that, he claimed that, okay, that we need a sovereign who will come in and protect us. And by the very fact of a sovereign who is strong enough to create a social order, we have everything. We have obligation. We also have to give them consent. We also owe them gratitude, and then we should not challenge that particular state. So, I mean, can't we say that if the Hobbesian argument essentially contains strains of all these arguments within it?
Yeah, so I mean, but Hobbes is generally would be classified as a social contract theorist and a consent theory of this. And yes, that's right. Like the argument is, if we don't have a government, our lives will be solitary, poor, nasty, brutish, and short, in his wonderful phrase. And maybe he's right. I think that in general, like when we look around at states of nature, they're not quite as bad as Hobbes made them out to be, but they're probably not the kinds of places most of us would want to live. But Hobbes takes it then, the authority that he gives the sovereign and the absolute obedience goes way too far, and it still leaves him open to the sovereign can get pretty bad. And when does our obligations end if it gets sufficiently bad? I think, though, that the best way to contextualize these problems and these arguments and think about it, and I think this is really relevant when you're, say, engaging in policy making, when you're participating in government and what government should, making decisions about what government will do, or not do, what services it will provide, what regulations it will create, and so on, is to think of the state as a moral remainder. So there's a philosopher, Rosalind Hursthouse, who talks about this in her book on virtue ethics. And so what she says is there are a lot of moral theories that tell us, here's a theory that will get you to what the right answer is in any given situation versus the wrong answer. So consequentialism says in any given moral situation you find yourself in, where you're facing a moral choice, add up the utility that will be created or destroyed by each side, the quantity of happiness, the quantity of well-being, whatever your measure is, and whichever one comes out on top, do that and you've done the right thing. So a utilitarian or consequentialist account of moral theory says morally right actions are whichever produce the best consequences. That's consequentialism is a bad moral theory, and that's one of the good reasons. Yeah.
Can consequentialism sort of be saved by looking at rule consequentialism instead of act consequentialism? Or do you think that?
No.
No.
There's a paper, and I can't remember the name of it. There's a paper by a philosopher named Roderick Long, where he, I think, persuasively argues that essentially rule consequentialism, if we take it seriously and start like trying to apply like what the rules are, collapses into act consequentialism. But act consequentialism, if we start trying to solve the problems with it, collapses into rule consequentialism. And so it's circular.
This is Roderick Long?
Roderick Long, but I cannot, I've read this paper once and I remember being really impressed with it, and then I've looked for it again and can't, so I'm pretty sure I didn't imagine this paper, but I've not been able to find it, so.
It's your theory.
Yeah. So consequentialism says we can get you to in any situation we can get you to the right answer. Deontology, which is another major moral theory, says instead, rather than trying to do this like math and adding up consequences and trying to answer the question of which consequences count and which people and how broad and how long into the future do we have to think? Like maybe the consequences look really bad now, but they could produce good consequences 100 years from now. Does that mean these are challenging questions? Instead, it says, here's basically a flow chart of rules. And your job as a moral agent is to figure out which rules apply in the situation and then follow the flow chart. And it will generate which is the right answer. And if you have successfully followed the rules, then you have arrived at the right answer. What Hursthouse points out is actually you can be in situations where there isn't a right answer, where you have to choose, and maybe you choose correctly in some way, but you've still done something bad or something you should feel bad about. You don't come out of it saying, I did the right thing. You come out of it saying, I did the best I could in a tragic situation, but I still feel terrible about having had to do that. And that is the moral remainder. That's that like lingering, I wish it could have been better, versus saying, I did the right thing because I followed these procedures. And I think we can think about the state as a moral remainder. So we can say, look, maybe we're going to act as if political obligation is grounded because the alternatives are terrible, right? But the reason the alternatives are terrible is because we collectively, individually, weren't good enough to have made them not terrible. right? Like if everybody was like perfectly moral, had perfect knowledge and so on, we wouldn't need laws against murder and enforcement because no one would be inclined to do it. We wouldn't need to solve a lot of these coordination problems because we would naturally solve it. Like if we were perfect beings, we wouldn't need this and we wouldn't be having this conversation, right? But we're not. And so we have to accept this thing that does some good, that does some harm, sometimes more good than harm, sometimes a lot more harm than good. But we shouldn't feel good about that. We should instead see it as this is like a necessary evil. And if it's a necessary evil, then what that means in our relationships to it and as we're guiding it and as we're making policy is it shifts the burden. So a lot of the times when we're thinking about policy, we say, here's a problem. We're going to pass a law that's going to solve it. We're going to create a new institution. We're going to regulate. And the way we justify that is simply to say, will it lead to the outcome that we hope? And then a lot of the times we forget about that, right? We tell a story of how to lead to the outcome. We institute the new program, and then we never go back to check if it actually solved the problem. We just keep doing it, right? That's bad. We shouldn't do that. We should evaluate whether things are working. But that's the story we tell, is like, will it work? And that's the consideration. What's the cost? Is it going to be expensive? That's the consideration. But I think instead what we should do is shift the burden. That you should recognize that every single time we add more commands to people, we take more resources, more things that they have to obey, because there's this question of the legitimacy of those commands. There's an element of this moral remainder. There's an element of like having still done something wrong by commanding someone and then enforcing. Because it's not a problem if I issue you commands but then never enforce them and you can safely ignore me and everybody knows they can just ignore me, then I haven't done a lot wrong maybe I'm irritating by shouting commands at you, but I haven't done much more than irritate you. But the problem is when I start enforcing them. If that's this moral remainder, then central to any conversation about new stuff the state should do, new laws it should pass, new programs it should compel us to pay for, new restrictions, and so on, should be, is it worth that? Is it worth doubling down on that moral remainder in order to do those things? Is the violation of liberty, of moral sovereignty, justified in this case? And sometimes the answer might be yes. Sometimes we might say, like, in order to prevent this greater wrong, this greater suffering, we're going to accept this kind of doubling down on this problematic authority. But sometimes the answer might be no. Sometimes we might say, like, yes, this thing is aiming at some goods, but they're not sufficient to justify further encroachments. And so rather than the state justifying its policies by their outcomes entirely, it should instead have to justify them to all of us and say, here's why I'm asking more of you, and here's why that's important and valid and you should put up with it. And so I think ultimately the conclusion, if you're not going to go to, say, political anarchism, is something more like shift the burden, force the state to justify its actions, and then in our own work, as either if you're in policy or you're just an ordinary voter or you're someone engaging in political debate, if there are opportunities to reduce this moral remainder, to take away unnecessary commands, while still achieving, right, while not making things worse in ways that outweigh them, we should jump on those. We should reduce this authority to the greatest extent possible and just make the world freer so that it's more moral. But that's challenging. It's hard to know. There's a lot of open questions in this, but I think that's, if there's like one conclusion I hope you take away, is that this should be a real consideration, and you should just have it present all the time so that we don't forget about this moral question and inadvertently be inflicting unnecessary moral wrongs. Thank you. Questions? Yes?
So we independently tackle, say, justice and consent. And so for instance, our state isn't really just. In our state, we haven't really granted consent to the state. But is there also sort of internal ranking in these preconditions for our obedience to the state? So for instance, if we forget the real world for a minute and we imagine a perfectly just state, would you say that we're morally obligated to then owe obedience to that state? Because I would think that, no, I would still have had to consent. So is there a sort of internal ranking to these preconditions?
I think so. And I think it's because the arguments can kind of fill in gaps for each other. So you might say, so we have a perfectly just state that you didn't consent to. You were born into it, right? And you don't have the opportunity to leave. Although that might be a problem with the justice of it if you can't leave. But some of the other feelings, like the gratitude account of a perfectly just state, is not going to be the one. The perfectly just state is probably not going to prevent the guy from saving you from the car in a way that doesn't break your legs, or is not going to be hurting people. The benefits are going to be greater in comparison to the costs. And so it might strengthen some of the other arguments. And so I think that we should, so when we're thinking in the real world too about these, we should keep that in mind, that there are certain things the state does that, and this applies, I think, even if we reject the arguments and we're just doing more of like the calculus about harms. If the state is demanding obedience and non-competition and taxation from you, but it's only using those to do genuinely just things, then I think we should be less concerned about, or more willing to trade off and say, well, okay, even if it would, even if you would be doing nothing wrong by refusing to obey that, it still is probably better to obey it because of the results it produces than if it's a much less just state doing.
It may be better, but it doesn't morally obligate me. Right? It's not a sufficient condition for moral obligation.
Right, or it's not a sufficient condition for moral obligation based on the command. So that's to just kind of restate the initial question. The question is not whether we're obligated to do things that produce good in the world. And then if we make a case that obedience, non-competition, taxation produces good, which if it's a perfectly just state, it might produce more good than its costs, then we should do those. Like that's a kind of obligation, but that's not quite political legitimacy, because what political legitimacy is that if you refuse, the reason that it's wrong for you to refuse is because of the authority of the person issuing the command versus the contents of the command or the effect of the command. It's rather that they have this thing called authority, and what authority does, to have authority is simply to be able to make commands that it is immoral to obey.
A relationship towards obligation towards the state and the size of the state. So for the longest time in most conversations, Singapore is cited as a beautiful example of things working. But I also hear from people who've been there about the extent of coercion they feel in their day-to-day lives, or the number of duties and obligations imposed on them as citizens living there. It's also serving as a state not just for people in Singapore but also nations across. Many find it easier to incorporate a company in Singapore but run it from India. So just trying to understand, and you spoke about how there is a beautiful origin of Athens, for example, as a small city-state where citizens felt more involved and they felt more duty-bound and obligated towards the state than, say, an entire region. So, is there a relationship in that sense?
So I think a lot of these arguments become stronger the smaller it is, both in terms of like size, population size, geographic size, etc., and more what we might call like size and scope of government. So like the quantity of things that it does and how much it asks in return for those. So consent, a shorter, clearer, more direct contract that you agree to, it's more likely that your consent is authentic to that than an enormous thing that you can't possibly have. You know, I always find stuff in the US about how members of Congress will receive legislation to vote on that is hundreds and hundreds of pages, and it's not just hundreds and hundreds of pages of rules. They're often, if you look at them, they're written in ways that don't make any sense, because they'll say, all that it will say is, in statute XYZ, change this word to this word. And so that only makes sense if you then go and look up statute XYZ and figure out like what's the actual change. So it's hundreds of pages, and they have like 24 hours before they have to vote on it, right? And so they can't possibly have made sense of what it is that they're voting on in that time. And even if they had weeks, they probably couldn't possibly have made sense of what that is, right? Versus if it were a single page with a very clear rule that you were voting on. Gratitude, association, those become fair play, those become stronger when it's more people you have personal connections to versus a billion people in, so I think that it is the case that smaller strengthens some of these arguments. It doesn't solve all of the problems with them, but even Athens. Athens was this democracy that felt very much like it was a democracy, and that's why they were willing to fight off the Persian Empire, because they felt this deep connection in a way that the subjects of the Persian king did not feel to their government. But it was only men, it was only propertied men, it was only men of certain classes who got to participate. It wasn't universal by any means. So I think one other way to think about this is we might be able to imagine, perhaps we could imagine a perfectly just state that satisfies all of the requirements that like all the problems we noted with the arguments. We might imagine a state that circumvents those problems, but it doesn't describe any actually existing state, and it's unlikely to, right? So that even if we could somehow set that up, which would be challenging because states claim all of the land, it's hard to set up new places. But even if we could get around that, there are other reasons why that probably wouldn't last, right? Incentives and so on might lead us away from that perfect state. But in general, I think political legitimacy looks more promising, kind of this smaller, but there are concerns there too of it can be, smaller communities can be more oppressive. The tighter knit can be harder to get out of if it's not, so there are trade-offs.